Like, think about this, guys. We've been in this for a year. The ability to go and just grab food and whatever drink you want and participate in class, it's fantastic. I don't know about you guys.
Imagine being able to brush your teeth during class. I just finished brushing my teeth.
Exactly. Exactly.
This is accurate. I have food.
Well, of course, not with every drink. Not whatever drink you want. I guess that's what somebody told me. See, I just heard her in the background. She goes, not any kind of drink. I'm like, oh.
Fair enough.
Milk. Let's go with milk.
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 Chocolate milk.
Okay.
Strawberry milk.
No.
Yes. Strawberry milk is good. I don't know.
How about water?
Watery milk.
That just sounds awful.
That's just 1% milk.
It is
True.
awful. Watery milk is awful.
Or what is it? Non-fat. What is?
No, it's 1%. You're right.
It's 1%. It's 1%.
It's like, here's some white food coloring.
My sentiments exactly. Finally, I have another brethren.
Now I got accustomed to what is it? It's not. I mean, whole milk is great, but I think it's 2%. 2%.
Fair enough.
The blue
The
one.
only way to drink milk is chocolate milk.
Skim milk.
Skim milk.
I miss soy milk.
Bad milk?
That's the greatest. Skim milk.
No, it's chocolate milk, man.
I can go for a good chocolate milk right now. A nice ice cold chocolate milk.
True.
Morning, everybody. On stream. Hopefully, y'all been enjoying this nice conversation about chocolate milk. And what else did I miss?
Skim milk, watery milk.
We just talked about milk.
Oh, the
and
watery
I-
milk
oh,
comment
and
was
I talk-
Janitza, right?
I talked about the advantages of
No, that was
doing
Dan.
stuff
No,
from
actually, it
home
was me.
online.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I said I found brethren. The haters of the milk that just is water with white food coloring.
True.
What was the advantages of what, Danny?
We've been in this for a year, right?
Almost.
Close to a year, almost. We're getting there. Being able to go to the fridge, grab something to eat, grab something to drink. Not anything you want to drink, right? That's when we got into the milk thing, because Dominique was like, they can't just have whatever they want. There's some implied things there, but they can go get something to drink, something to eat, and join the class.
Yeah.
Be in their PJs, Let's say, oh, I woke up, forgot to brush my teeth. Hey, guess what? You can take the phone with you into the bathroom, brush your teeth while still listening to the class. How about that?
Love that.
You know?
Sleep in a little bit.
I'm with you there.
Yes, that's amazing.
I'm now sharing the screen, by the way, everybody on Zoom. Can you see?
I'm gonna say something obnoxious just because it's on Twitch, and no, I'm joking. I'll leave you guys to it.
All right, Danny.
All right. God bless, guys.
I'll see you later.
Hi, Dan.
Ask questions. Don't be afraid.
It's like I say, the only dumb question is the question you don't ask. Because then it's not even a question at all. That's what makes it dumb.
Why is the sky blue?
That's going to be for another class. Today we're going to be talking about water and Jonah and fishes.
Well, since y'all are talking about water, the long-aged question, is water wet? I'll leave you guys to debate that one.
All right, that's a good discussion, everybody. Let's talk about Jonah. But we're revisiting Jonah. Is it because my dad's covering it right now? I mean, I guess you could say that, but let's just say that he inspired me to just revisit it, because it's almost going to be a full year since we've covered Jonah in March. So it's like 10 months since we last talked about Jonah. And I mean, It's always good to revisit things, in the Bible. It's always good to revisit stories we talked about in the past, and always revisit them with a new, fresh look, fresh eyes. Because there's always a danger of whenever you're reading the Bible, you become so used to something, to a term, to a story, that you gloss over the deep profoundness and truths that lie within it. And that's what we're doing with Jonah again. We're revisiting it. And Jonah, I mean, what can I say? It's, as much as I love the VeggieTales movie, and I think it does a really good job breaking it down, especially for children, it's definitely a story written to adults. Like, you really have to be an adult or enough life experience to really get what's going on in this story, because it's surprisingly sophisticated and can actually be really disturbing and challenging. The book of Jonah, it's this comic satire story of this rebellious hypocrite prophet, this man of God who runs from his own God and from his sin and selfishness. And as we talked about last week, it turns him into this, this sleepwalking, apathetic, spiritual asleep guy, and becoming what we can call a relational wrecking ball, where his sin is just spilling over his life and into the lives of other people. And he's so tuned out to God and his own emotions, and where we ended the story last week was that he's thrown over the side of the boat, and he's sinking into the depths of the sea, and if Jonah were a one-chapter story, if the story ended right there, being eaten by the fish, I mean, it's a tragic story. He's dead. He's done. That's what you would say, right? There's no goodness in being eaten by a fish. It's a tragic story. That's what we would think if it's just one chapter. But see, what we're going to pick up right at this moment, where you think he's dead, and this huge fish swallowed him, and he's going to be in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, And you're supposed to be like, oh gosh, that's a horrible way to die. But the story doesn't end, right? It surprisingly takes this twist. And, the crazy thing that we're going to see this week is that Jonah has this encounter with his own death. Like, he literally looks down the meth, both literally, metaphorically, of death itself. It swallows him up. And maybe you're thinking, oh, this is a guy getting what's coming to him. God is allowing him to deal with the consequences of his own decisions. But then it's exactly this. That it's the gospel right here in the story. That it's right when he hits bottom and swallowed up by the consequences of his silly, foolish, selfish behavior, the God of Israel turns that vehicle of death into this bizarre vehicle of grace. That all of a sudden, he gives them a second chance at life by opening his eyes to what's happening. And so what you end up with in this strange story, I think, is one of the most arresting and convicting images as any story in the whole Bible. And we're going to work our way through that story. So let's go back to chapter 1 real quick, the end of verse 17. Now, the Lord, remember when we see Lord in all caps, it's stand-in for Yahweh, by name of God. So Yahweh provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And so what is Jonah doing inside of the fish, I mean, we know he's not dead. What is he doing?
Praying.
Okay, he's praying. I'll do you one better. He's composing a beautifully intricate Hebrew poem that represents his prayer to God. Which is, I'm sure, what all of you would be doing, if you were in those circumstances, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because I mean, we're going to read through chapter 2, right? That's this entire, we're going to read through it. And you tell me if that's your standard prayer, especially in a situation like this, Like, this is bizarre. This is weird. If you've been hearing this story for so long, it's not bizarre to you anymore, but I'm going to tell you this. Wake up. It's a strange story. It's weird, because, I mean, he's in a fish, right? So he's probably surrounded, like, he's in these cramped, tight surroundings. He's cramped up, like, in a ball, maybe, for all we know. And there's maybe like fish parts and squid beaks, you know, if the fish like eats squid and, you know, and other things, and he's just floating around, and there's like a lack of oxygen there. It's just crazy image, you know? And here he is just composing this intricate, this beautiful poem, this prayer. Now this fits with the storytelling style of the story, right? You know? And this, well, let's recap this sort of mini discussion we had last time about, you know, what this image reminds us of, this question, right? It's this question or big picture of that, you know, for among Orthodox Christian scholars and teachers, you know, there's two views, right? One is that the author is putting forward this story with the claim that it is historical narrative. And if that's the case, then this part of the story, this prayer, this experience, it would have to come from some kind of personal testimony of Jonah himself and his experience. And that's one view. The other view, which is also held by Orthodox scholars, you know, like the Bible is God's word, believe-in teachers, you know. The other view is that the author does not intend it to be historical narrative. Rather, the author expects us to see the stories like a parable, as if of all kinds of clues. You know, taking a known historical figure, because Jonah is a real guy, he's in 1 Kings, and, you know, taking him and putting him in a parable setting. And these views are both held by lots of different people, you know, respectable believers in Christ. And regardless of the view, though, everybody, regardless of the view, agrees on this like satire, comic book feel, the story style. And that everything in the story is over the top, because you have stereotyped characters, but everyone's the opposite of stereotype in how they behave. Remember, like the pagan sailors from the first chapter, and then we're going to see the Ninevites in the next chapter, and everything is extreme, big, and intense, and, you know, and this part just sort of fits into that. You know, a man composing beautiful, intricate poetry cramped in the confines of a fish's stomach. You know? And you know, don't get confused. Don't think about like, oh, if you think it's a parable, then you don't really believe in miracles. Like, I'm gonna stop you right there, because there's nothing else more ridiculous than that statement. Because we're a community whose foundation is based on the conviction that God raised Jesus from the dead, and that is, in my mind, far more difficult to believe than that a guy can survive in the fish's stomach. You know what I'm saying? So the views and if it's a parable or historical narrative has nothing to do with whether I believe in miracles or not. At the end of the day, it has to do with submitting myself to the scriptures and not making them into something that I think they ought to be, but allowing the author and the Spirit of God to shape, to tell me what kind of story it's telling. And regardless of your view is, it's a crazy story. And you're still going to go like, whoa, what is happening here? And I have to apologize for something, guys. You know how last week how I said, you know, like the fish is not the thing of the story? Y'all remember that?
Yep.
Well, I'm going to have to fixate on the fish for a bit. because there's something significant about just the imagery and the representation of the fish. Whether literal or parable, like there's something really significant about the situation. You know, but the question is this, like, what does the author of Jonah, what does he expect to see in this image of this moment of the story of a man swallowed up by a fish because of his own stupid sin and then praying? Because we're going to see a prayer of repentance and transformation from within the fish. And so, you know, what are the readers of this story? Well, you know, how do they understand this? What are we supposed to know? You know? And, I mean, the first step, you know, I mean, it's like two steps, you know? And like one of them is like, whenever you're looking for an image in this part of the story, you know, you have to consider it in its biblical kind of setting, you know, the biblical ancient setting, you know? And then after that, the question is, you know, like, how does it speak God's word to us? And tell me if this is relatable or not, you know? I think this is a problem that we have with the Bible. You know, we have lots of problems with the Bible. It's a difficult book to read. But, you know, I think one of the things that happens is that because it's a difficult book to read, that we get into this mode of reading the Bible and we're like, Okay, I don't understand. I'm not getting it. Not getting it. Not getting it. Oh, that's a cool sentence. I like that one. I'm gonna make a cross stitch out of it. I'm gonna put it on my wall, and then all right, I'm gonna move on. Okay, I don't get that. I don't get that. Oh, that's a cool bumper sticker. Is that a relatable experience for some of you?
Yeah.
Yeah, like
Yeah. And sort of you hear the ones, like more so I guess, you hear the ones that are, like how you said, the bumper sticker verses, if you will, or you hear them more often, so they kind of, in my personal experience, stick in my brain a little more.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think it's a common experience that a lot of people have. You know, like they go to read a Bible, but they just don't understand it, and they just end up seeing, oh, I like that one though, and they pull it out. And I think that's how like a lot of Christians operate with the Bible. And what happens by that is that it leads to this view that the Bible is just this collection of like individual, self-contained, cool little sentences I use for personal inspiration or to warm my heart or something. But here's the problem, is that if you begin to just read the Bible as a little grab bag of individual sentences that tell me God's will, to do this and to do that, you can literally just find a sentence in the Bible by just taking it out and reading it by itself, and you can make it say almost anything you want. You can make the Bible say anything you want if you read the Bible like that. And so the first rule, then, and it's not even a religious thing, this is just the first rule of being a good listener. Being a good listener in any active communication is context. Right? And so we're looking at Jonah, and the first thing is, what on earth is a story about a rebellious Israelite prophet getting swallowed by a fish, and then praying, and then getting vomited out? Like, what does that mean? And what that means depends on the context. And, if you read the book like never reading any part of the Bible, then it's like, oh, okay, it's just some random story of a guy and got eaten by a fish, and of course he's going to be thrown up, he's being saved by God and whatever. And maybe the lesson of the day is like, you should obey God, you shouldn't run away from him, And, I don't know poetry, I don't have to learn it. Learn poetry in case you get eaten by a fish so you can craft it inside, That's the kind of lesson you get to just look at the book of Jonah by itself. And God shows mercy to your enemies and whatever. But there's something much deeper, more significant you're missing out if you don't think of the context. Think about the importance of context, let's say you're sitting in a coffee shop. And, you're just sitting there, and then you decide, oh, I'm going to tune into this conversation that these three ladies are having behind of you. And then you just tune in like you tune on the radio, and the first thing you hear is, I'm going to kill him. What is she talking about?
Hopefully not first-degree murder.
Hopefully not first-degree murder, right? Like, do I need to call the police, Like maybe, like if you have the context, maybe you have to go back and realize that, oh, she's writing a book, right? And she's talking about this character that she's going to kill off, like, oh yeah, I'm going to kill him off in the next chapter. Or maybe she's talking about her dog, or like, or her boyfriend, and in the sense of like they did something up, they screwed something up, like they forgot her anniversary, and like, oh, I'm going to kill him. Like that kind of expression, but... Or maybe she is talking about first degree murder. I don't know. But you see the importance of having context. You need to know her story. Where she came from. Her backstory. What led up to these series of events. And it's the same thing. The exact same thing with the Bible in any sentence or passage that you read. So, question everybody. Did the book of Jonah fall from heaven? Did it just fall out of heaven?
No.
Right. It occurs in a context. And the question is, what is that context? Well, let's go to the first chapter. The first sentence. The word of Yahweh came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Now, what kinds of people does the word of the Lord come to in the Bible?
People that are going to be used by God.
Okay. There's a specific name for them.
Prophets?
Yes, Jonah was a prophet. Ooh, ooh. Yeah, prophets. I mean, remember the order and structure of the Hebrew Bible, right? Where does Jonah occur? Amongst the prophets, right? Right? He's not in the Torah and the law and the teachings. He's not in the writings. He's in the prophets, right? He occurs among the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And that is its context. So if that's where the context, then you have to back up even further, right? And like, okay, so what are the prophets about now? And, you know, if you try to read the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, it's a really challenging experience because they're some of the most difficult books of the Bible to read, you know? There's really intense imagery and poetry. But I think, you know, what they're about, you can create like a basic plot line, you know? And here I would like draw the plot line, I suppose, but I don't. But, you know, just bear with me, just listen along. And so the basic idea of the prophets is this, right? So it's a story of Israel, basically. You know, God redeems his people out of Israel, out of slavery in Egypt. He brings them into a covenant relationship with himself, right? He gives them his instruction, his Torah, about how they are to live as a holy witness to the nations. And then he brings them into the promised land. And so, how do the Israelites, how do they do at living in a covenant relationship with the God who redeems them?
Terribly.
Not good.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's terrible, you know? And this is where the prophets step onto the scene, all right? You know, the people of Israel, they abandon Yahweh, they give their allegiance to other gods or idolize things, that they turn into gods like military power or wealth or something, and it leads them to injustice and sin and abandonment and faithlessness to Yahweh. And so the prophets come onto the scene. In all the books of the prophets, you could summarize it into this like this basic, you know, addressing this structure. Is that they're basically accusing Israel of their sin and their faithlessness. And they're warning Israel that if they don't turn their ways, they're going to have to deal with the consequences of these decisions. Which ultimately is the ultimate consequence, which is the big bad empire of Babylon, sweeping in and besieging the city of Jerusalem, capturing the city and hauling Israelites off into exile. And that's a huge theme of the prophets, basically. You know? Here's what you're doing. Here's how you've abandoned the covenant. Here's what's going to happen if you don't turn. But see, Yahweh's commitment to his promises is even stronger than Israel's rebellion and sin. And the prophets always look forward to this time on the other side of exile. After the exile is over, after Babylon invades and exile is over. That God is going to preserve a remnant. He's going to continue, you know, the story in a new future out on the other side. And that's the prophets in a nutshell, you know? I'd say now you don't have to read the prophets, but no, go read them, but they're really difficult. But now you have the gist of what they're about, you know? They're pointing out Israel's sin and failure to live as God's people. Here's the consequence if they don't turn, but there's hope on the other side. That God is going to remain committed to them and preserve them and redeem them, you know? And so Jonah occurs amongst the prophets, right? And the prophets, like we said, they're about rebellious people of God who abandon their God and they end up suffering the consequences. But then God's grace redeems them, brings them out to the other side. I wonder if that sounds familiar to a story that we're reading right now. It's Jonah.
I thought it was a rhetorical question. I apologize. Yeah, it sounds like Jonah.
It is a rhetorical question, but I was inviting, you know.
It means
So I
it's
guess
not meant to be.
that's true. Then it's not rhetorical if I'm inviting answers. You're right. But yeah, that's literally the story of Jonah. And so while the other books of the prophets are collections of words and poetry of the prophets, the book of Jonah is the only story about a prophet. You know, it's what's so amazing about it is that this book about a prophet still is the exact storyline of the prophets in general. All right, So, here's something even more interesting that we can dive into. Okay? So, the prophets, you know, a lot of it is poetry. It's intricate, elaborate, deep poetry with metaphors and images that they develop. And as the prophets start off, they begin to like get images and imagery and metaphors from the previous ones. You know, they sort of look at them as examples, inspiration. Like, oh, they talked about this in such and such way. I'm going to pull from that and I'm going to elaborate and build on top of that image, you know? The prophets sort of like work together in a sense, like over time, you know, like being guided by the Spirit. Like, this image is exactly the kind of image I like. I like how they use this image. I'm going to use it as well in my own poetry. And there was this particular image that would rise up whenever talking about the exile and the consequences of Israel's sin. And, you know, let's talk about that, right? It's one of the earliest prophets, you know, Hosea. He developed a whole bunch of poetic imagery that the future prophets would pull from. And let's just do a random sampling. Let's just go to chapter 8 of Hosea. And let's just see. Let's just read the connections. Okay. They set up kings without my consent. They choose princes without my approval. So this is Yahweh speaking through Hosea, right? With their silver and gold, they make idols for themselves to their own destruction. Samaria, throw out your calf idol. My anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of purity? They are from Israel. This calf a metalworker has made it is not God. It will be broken in pieces. The calf of Samaria. They will sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. The stalk has no head. It will produce no flower were it to yield grain. Foreigners would swallow it up. Israel is swallowed up. Now she's among the nations like something no one wants. Huh. Does anything stand out there? Some word that's out there?
Swallow.
Swallowed. Interesting. You know, so Hosea here, he's saying that a nation is going to come, right? A mighty king is coming. He's going to take over Israel as a result of their foolish decisions. And the metaphor he uses to describe this is that they're going to be swallowed up. Now, like I said, Hosea was one of the earliest prophets. And lots of prophets came after and ended up picking up some of the images and lines that he used and developing further. Jeremiah is a really good example. And here he is, he's describing how Babylon is going to come to town and, you know, take over and everything. And so look how he describes it, right? 51:34, Jeremiah. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, has devoured us. He has thrown us into confusion. He has made us an empty jar. Like a serpent, he has swallowed us and filled his stomach with our delicacies and then has spewed us out. Some translations even have sea monster instead of serpent. So Jeremiah is developing this image, you know, that God has like allowed or raised up this beast to come and swallow up God's own people as a result of their faithlessness. You know, and now it's not just the prophets who just speak of this way. You know, there's this last batch, this passage I'll show you in the book of Psalms. So remember, the book of Psalms, it has a lot of prayers and poems of like David and Solomon and other people who lived before the exile. But it also includes a lot of poems written by people who are after, on the other side of exile. So look how Psalms 124 looks backwards on this story. All right? Hold on to your seats. If Yahweh had not been on our side, let Israel say, if Yahweh had not been on our side when people attacked us, they would have swallowed us alive. When their anger flared against us, the flood would have engulfed us, the torrent would have swept over us, the raging waters would have swept us away. So the prophets and the poets of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, a very common way to describe Israel's sin and their suffering the consequences of the sin of exile of Babylon was like drowning in the flood, being swallowed by a great sea monster. And the author of Jonah comes along and he takes these images, and whether it's historical or not, he's making a point. He's weaving it into this narrative about one Israelite who, through their life story and through their experience, lives this whole story in this narrative form before us. You guys with me? Like, in other words, the author, the biblical author of Jonah, knows exactly what he's doing. And this image of being trapped is basically like the readers of the ancient context, they would have seen themselves in this story. They would have seen their own story, the Israelite story, in here in Jonah. You know, because the story of their own faithlessness, they're suffering the consequences, the suffering of their own consequences. And the big question mark is like, is God going to be faithful and redeem us out on the other side? And that's what we're talking about today. So that's the fish. Y'all see like the significance of the fish now, of what it represents. You know, the importance and deep meaning. So, like I said, I'm sorry for saying the fish is not the point of the story, because you know it's not. But at the same time, we can't just ignore the purpose and the point of its image and its role in the story. What the fish ultimately is, it's this misunderstood item in the story. It's just another way to represent the message of the prophets. So let's go tune back into Jonah, right? So here's Jonah. He's quite proud of himself. You know, he's been able to run from Yahweh. You know, he's able to do that. You know, sailing for Tarshish, and then he's declared autonomy from God. But then all of a sudden it catches up with him. You know, his selfishness catches up with him, and it's this great snowball effect that leads him. You know, it's decisions. You know, it's leaving him down. You know, he goes down to Tarshish, down to the ship, down into the ship, down into a sleep, now down into the ocean. And so it's this, you know, repetition of, you know, going down, down, down until he can't go down any further. And, you know, like it's the exact opposite, you know, of this wide open horizon. He's sailing the seven seas and whatever. He's now confined in the belly of this beast. And, you know, it creates this image of being trapped in seasons of hardship or suffering or pain or confusion. And in Jonah's case, he's here because it's a mess of his own making. You know? So what do you do when you're here? How do you pray through this? How do you process through it? You know, so really what this prayer that we're going to read, it's an invitation for us to see Jonah's experience of praying through his hardship and his suffering, and the fact that this image of being swallowed up by the beast, you know, it's such a powerful image in this story now, because Jonah's here as a result of his own decisions, you know? He doesn't have a lot to, like, cry about. You know, he can't blame anybody but himself. You know, but, you know, God's people end up in the belly of the beast. Sometimes, though. Not always as a result of their own decisions, though. You know, like, think of the book of Daniel, right? He's a pretty stand-up guy, Daniel. But why is he in exile? We talked about this before. Is he there because of his own sin? The consequences of his decisions? It's not. He's exiled to Babylon because of his parents and his grandparents' sin and selfishness. You know? So that brings up a second question. Like, okay, so what do you do with that? How do you pray through when you're sitting in the belly of the beast? You know? And there's like no discernible reason that you can see as to, you know? You can't tell, like, if it's actually someone else's own sin that spilled over into my own life. You know? How do you do that? How do you pray in those circumstances when you're trapped? When it's dark and it's confusing, you can't see. And you can't see if it's your own fault or you can't pin it on anybody else. It's just a tragedy. You know, that's just all you can see. What do you do? And so it's these times of being in these dark, confined spaces. That's what this prayer is about. And what I invite you to do is think about how this ancient biblical image speaks to us. That's how I invite you to do as we go through this prayer. You know, to think about your own story. You know, because some of you might be in one of these spaces right now. You know, you might be there because of the mess of your own making. You might be there because someone else's foolishness had spilled over into your life. Or maybe there's just no reason that you can discern. You know, your life is just falling apart. You don't know why. So I encourage you, you know, if you ever been there or are there or in the future if you find yourself there, to go through this prayer and just use it as a way to think through your own experience and your own relationship to God. And how do you process through it? Okay? So, let's just dive in. So verse 1, from inside the fish, Jonah prayed to Yahweh his God. He said, in my distress, I called to Yahweh, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. Remember, Lord in all caps, Yahweh, divine name, a Hebrew name. So, the realm of the dead, some of y'all might have translations like Sheol, which is just the Hebrew name for grave, Hebrew word for grave. It's realm of the dead, grave. So yeah, so from deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. So, first thing that this hardship causes in Jonah's life is that it causes him to cry out, to yell for help. It's, like we might think it's crying out, like something like, oh, I'm crying out for help and whatever. But let's stop and think about that. I don't know if you've ever had any life experience in your past where, like, literally you were in a moment of danger and that it was just out of control, and you can't do anything else but cry out. It's just almost instinctively cry out for help. I don't know if any of you have been in that experience, but it's a visceral experience. Like, I got nothing, I need help, I have no resources. Like please save me. And so that's a kind of cry out that he's talking about here. This hardship brings him to a place where he has nothing else to do except to cry out. And notice what he says about God here, right? It says, you listen. He listened, and you're listening now. And I think this is interesting, because I think most of us, when we end up in seasons of life that are like this, where things are falling apart, and where we feel confused or alone or trapped in our life circumstances, many of us, the default mode we're in is that, oh, God's not listening to me. He's nowhere to be found. He's abandoned me. And Jonah, he draws exactly the opposite conclusion. He's at the bottom, rock bottom. He has nothing for him going for him. He's in this helpless situation. It's like death is almost certain. And he draws the exact opposite conclusion, that it's in precisely those moments that God is closest and most involved in attendance. It's interesting. Why does he draw that conclusion? Well, let's keep going. Because there's something about this experience, about this sudden experience, that, being cramped in this situation and being at rock bottom, it's heightening his awareness of God's presence. All right? And we see that in verse 3. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and a current swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. So who does he say, who threw him into the depths? Who is Jonah saying who did it? Whose waves and breakers? Not a rhetorical question.
The Lord says you.
Right? Who else is Jonah going to be talking about? God. Now this is very interesting, because remember from chapter 1, who threw him overboard?
The pirates?
Yeah, I did this. The pirates.
The pirates.
Pirates did not do anything. The sailors, right. But who does Jonah say who threw him into the sea?
God.
Yeah. Now we're going to step into some territory here. It's a hard pill for some of us to swallow, and this can be very disturbing. And some of us are going to be ticked off. And that's okay. Read the book of Psalms. There's a lot of people who are ticked off and frustrated and confused about how God related to their lives. So, yes, of course, the sailors threw him over. But Jonah sees, though all these sudden circumstances that have brought him to the bottom, where all he could do is cry out, he sees God's involvement and hand in it. You have to stop and you have to think, well, what's happening in the story? Because who is ultimately responsible for Jonah ending up in this whole mess? Is it God's fault that Jonah made stupid decisions? Is it God's responsibility that Jonah made horrible decisions?
Nope.
No. Of course not. And so, there's no question that God's not responsible for Jonah's, 10 out of 10 decision making. But let's say you end up in the belly of the beast, because of someone else's sin. So let's think of another biblical story. The story of Joseph, where his brothers, they plot to kill him, but they decide to be merciful. Instead, they just throw him in a pit and sell him to slavery. That's a better option, right? But then, yes, of course, God providentially uses that whole story as redemptively, But is God responsible for the brother's sin that spill over into Jonah's life? No. That's their responsibility. It's their moral responsibility. Yet Jonah sees that whether it's someone else's sin, or whether it's his sin, his failure, that lands him right here in this confined, difficult hardship, God isn't biting his fingernails. God's not surprised. And there may, in fact, be times, as Jonah's indicated, where God is the one who brought him into this experience out of hardship. Because you hurled me here. Or somehow, that it somehow fits into God's providential plan. Which doesn't mean that God is the author of my circumstances, But it does mean that nothing here surprises him. In that he's going to work this out redemptively for his purposes. Alright? And now here's the crazy part. Alright? And the best way to describe this is a severe mercy. It's a severe mercy. That's what Jonah wakes up to here. He wakes up to the fact that God is dealing him of severe mercy. And it's very severe. I mean, there's nothing more severe than, like drowning and then being swallowed up by a huge fish. And Jonah, he sees God's fingerprints all over it. It doesn't mean that God's responsible for Jonah's decisions. But it does mean now that he's made those decisions, God is present with him. And that God is not just going to be his little genie in a bottle that rescues him out of all of his problems. It means that God is with him, but in a way that's different than many of us might feel comfortable with. So here's really what this gets us, right? This is what's hard for us to hear. It's because most of us, we have this default assumption that we invite into our lives, that God invites us to give a smooth passage to our chosen destination, and hopefully with a little comfort and security and safety along the way, right? What stories like this, or stories like the story of Abraham and Isaac, like in Genesis 22 where God tests Abraham, what they show us is that if your idea of God is that his greatest priority is to make you safe and comfortable and happy, if you have that, if that's your idea of who God is, then I'll save you the effort. Please become an atheist. Because your whole life experience is going to expose how that view of God is wrong. And how that's not the God presented to us in the scriptures, Because in the scriptures, God's highest priority is, and let me get this straight, it's not that it's not a priority of God. It's that it's not God's highest priority. God's highest priority is to call people to himself and to mold and shape their character so that they come to understand the truth of who they are as creatures made in the image of their creator and come to discover the truth of God. That we make really poor captains of our own ship because we conveniently make the ship sail to whatever it is best for me, whether it's at the expense of others, in ways that are very selfish and sometimes self-destructive. And sometimes, in God's severe mercy, he may deal with us in ways that brings us to the end of ourselves. And we might hate him for it. But here's the thing. Here's the beautiful paradox of it. The paradox of God's severe mercy is that this could be the best thing that ever happens to us. Because we discover the truth of how broken and selfish we are. We discover the truth that I've been taking my life for granted as if I can do whatever I want with it. And that the only reason I exist is because someone else made me. and I'm not the captain of my own ship. And it brings us to this place of dependence and humility. And that's a crazy place to be. Now, I don't have the authority to say, like how that applies in your life or whatever, and what circumstances that applies in, and whether this is a severe mercy or that, I don't have the authority to say that, But the scriptures are very clear, is that there is no sin of my own, and there is no sin of anybody else's that's beyond God's redemptive reach. To do and to use as an opportunity to shape me in a deep, deep way. And that is God's highest priority, to shape us into image of his Son, as Paul says in Romans chapter 8. And again, and this might tick you off, because it might mean that you get tossed overboard because of something stupid you did or something stupid someone else did. But let's keep going. Let's keep going on how we process through that, Let's keep going. Verse 4. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again towards your holy temple. So here's Jonah talking to himself, It's very interesting. Because what he's saying here is that, oh my gosh, I thought for a second that I'd really gotten what I wanted. I wanted smooth passage to Tarshish, to run away from Yahweh, to get him out of my life. And he sees where that lands him. It lands him rock bottom. And then it's like this moment, which is forehead moment, where just, he's slapping his forehead. It's like, oh my gosh. I realized, I thought I got what I wanted, but in reality, I lost it, I realized it was a horrible, horrible thing. And I thought that was banished from you. You can see the shift of priorities here, That all of a sudden, the idea of going to Tarshish and being his own god and the captain of his own ship, all of a sudden seems like the worst possible thing, It's like when you get what you always wanted and you realize that it just sucks. It's horrible, And that's Tarshish for Jonah. It's not going to give you what you're looking for in life. And so exactly at that moment, you realize, like, oh my gosh, I almost got what I wanted. I was almost banished from God's sight. But then he turns around and he says, he looks to God's presence in his temple. And all of a sudden, looking back and turning back to God becomes very attractive. And this is crazy because this guy goes from, his experience so far is like, he runs from God thinking that God is a killjoy, telling me what to do and commanding me and whatever. But then he sees that we're running from God, that God, we're running from life itself. All God was trying to do in the first place is give him life. And so what it takes Jonah to do is it takes him to hit bottom before he realizes, like, oh my gosh, it was the God of mercy who's been chasing me this whole time. And it's just that strange place, that, there are people who say, oh, I don't need God, because my ship's going pretty good. And they may get to Tarshish, or maybe they won't. And at some point, they'll realize that maybe it's not what they wanted in life, Because there's a lot of people out there who they're not going to be interested in Jesus. And you're not going to be able to convince them otherwise. Except to be that presence in their life when their ship goes down. Because then all of a sudden, everything changes. And coming to Jesus looks attractive now. And they realize that what they really wanted in life was not the best thing. So that's what Jonah's talking about here. I've banished from your sight. Yet, I will look again towards your holy temple. So then he goes over this moment again. And even more depth, Look at verse 5. Where he says, this experience made him realize that he not only needs God, that God is the only thing he has going for him. Look at verse 5. He says, the engulfing waters threatened me, and the deep surrounded me. Seaweed wrapped around my head. Again, it's just images of, like him sinking deep down and being wrapped around by these dark circumstances. It's also pretty funny, like how the seaweed's like wrapping around his head, like a seaweed hat, maybe. I don't know. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. These images of just down, down, down. Sinking further into his sin and these circumstances. Do these images give you hope that this is reversible? That there's a way to come back from this?
Not really.
Not really, no. But then there's this little ski jump at the end. But you, Yahweh my God, you brought my life up from the pit. You know? It's that sensation, that experience, when you go through this experience where it's like having your life like almost stripped away from you. It sort of clears away the clutter in your life. You know, everything's just very clear. You see the boundary line of your life. And it's not very far away. Yeah, that's what Jonah's experiencing here. And he's realizing that the only thing he has going for him is the fact that God is committed to him. He knows the only thing I have going for me is the fact that God is committed to redeeming my life from something. Like, I can't see any way out of it. And what's crazy about this is that it's paradoxically the worst experience you could have, but also the best experience you could have, because you discover the truth of who you are as a frail human, whose creator is tuned to mercy and grace and faithfulness, which is what motivates him to say what he says next. You know, this is how he closes. He merges out of this with gratefulness, out of this hardship. You know, he says, when my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, O Yahweh, and my prayer rose to your holy temple. So right at this moment, he is at the brink of death, and suddenly he has this very positive experience where he's like, yeah, I remember. He's remembering, I remember Yahweh. And remembering in the Old Testament is a very common theme, in which you recall all the gifts and the goodness that Yahweh has shown towards you up to this point. And it's like, when he was on his way to Tarshish, he was like totally ignoring all the things that God had done for him. All the good that God had given him. That God had given him a life in the first place. And all of a sudden, he's at the brink of his own death. He realizes all these amazing ways God has shown favor and mercy and grace to him. And so on. So here he is. He's having this prayer of remembrance and thanks. And where is he? Has he left the belly of the fish? Has he? Does it say he's left?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah. So he's in the belly of the fish, and he's having this positive turn to gratefulness. And that's crazy. What on earth would generate gratefulness when you're in the midst of the circumstance? And again, this is the paradox. When you discover the truth of who you are, and the only thing I got going for me is God's merciful faithfulness to me, to redeem me out of the mess of my own making, or the mess of somebody else's own making. And when I realize that all of a sudden, all of a sudden it's just a realization dawns on you. My life doesn't belong to me anymore, in the first place. And as a Christian, this is even more true. He turns, he says, his prayer goes to the holy temple. He remembers God's presence and character. He looks to the hot spot of God's presence. And as a follower of Jesus, where's the hot spot of God's presence that I look to remember who God is, even if my life is passing away? Yes, it's the easy church answer. It's Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth. And so this is so important in these seasons. Because what we want to do is that we want to look at our life circumstances and use those as a reliable indicator of how God feels towards me. And what Jonah says clearly, he's come to the conviction that his circumstances have nothing to do with God's commitment to him. And that they are not a reliable indicator of God's feelings or commitment to him. Instead, we look to one place to understand and discover who God is to me. And that is the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. That's what we look to. That's who we look to. And becoming a Christian is realizing that his life, was lived, for his death, it was for me and for my sin and selfishness. And his resurrection life offers grace and a new chance at life to me. And that to me, this is the only thing I have going for me. That's it. And when you can come to that place, where it's like, it doesn't matter what happens in your life. I know who I belong to. I know the one in whom my identity is grounded in. And regardless of what happens in my life, he's right there. My life is still in his hands, And you can end up becoming grateful and thankful. It reminds me of the story of Paul and Silas in chapter 16. When they're in prison because they've been talking about Jesus too much. And they're chained up. And they're about to, they could possibly get executed. They might not even live through the night because they could possibly get executed. And what are these guys doing in prison? Does anyone remember this story?
Is that when they're singing?
Yeah, they're singing little poems and psalms to Jesus of gratefulness and praise. And, Jonah, we can have the excuse that, maybe he's just running out of oxygen. He's going crazy because there's no oxygen inside of there. But there was lots of oxygen in the prison for Paul and Silas. They were clearly rational, thinking clearly, and they were on the conviction that, I live my life in a way that doesn't belong to me anyway. And so if God deals a severe mercy through this experience, then I trust that he has my best in mind. That he's shaping me through this experience. And so it ends up in this place of worship. And Jonah concludes this prayer. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from Yahweh. So why is he talking about idols? Well, he's talking about this idea of declaring his own autonomy from God and to chart his own independent life course separate of God, independent of God. And it's this realization, I idolize my own autonomy in my own direction. And then all of a sudden I realized, oh my gosh, the only thing I have going for me is the grace and faithfulness and mercy of God. And that's the reason I exist in the first place. It's oh my gosh. It leads into this act of thankfulness and worship. And shouts of praise, shouts of grateful praise, sacrifice to you. It's this pure, ecstatic gratefulness. Deep in the belly of the fish. And he says it out loud. Salvation comes from Yahweh. So the question for you this morning is, how is this the word of God to you? I can't tell you, the answer to that. I can't tell you what's happened in your life circumstance. And maybe you're thinking about a past experience where you feel you've been in the belly of the beast. Or maybe you feel like you're currently in the belly of the beast. This prayer invites us to consider is that God may be dealing us a severe mercy. And it's a crazy place to be, because it's both the best but feels like the worst thing that could ever happen to us. And what it does is that it puts you in a basic position of trust. Do I trust that God has my best in mind? And how can you know such a thing? The world's crazy. Life is really hard. Where do you go for assurance that God's commitment is for your best? And I mean, as a Christian, we say as community of Jesus, there's just one place that we point to. That we point each other towards to. For that assurance. And it's to the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. And if you belong to him, you can look to the cross and know that you may not be spared being in the belly of the beast, but God can use that experience to do profound work in our lives that perhaps he could do no other way. And so I don't have the authority to tell you that about your lives, but we believe the scriptures do, right? And so as we continue on with our day, with our week, we go into Danny's message. I encourage you to sit with this prayer in front of you. Maybe some of us, we need to be ticked off, and frustrated at God. Some of us, maybe we're having an oh my gosh moment. Oh my gosh, I know exactly why I'm in the mess that I'm in, and I need to turn, I need to change, and look back to God. And maybe some of us are just in the whole spectrum in between. And so, I'm going to end the class like that. And I encourage you that just process and think about this throughout this entire week. That Jesus said that he's present in a unique way when we gather together. And that he promises that he will be with us always. And that includes being in the belly of the beast. And then Yahweh commanded a fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Talk about a tone changer, huh? Talk about a tone shift. And that's for next time. That's for next time. So, questions, comments, thoughts that you'd like to bring up as we end the day? Anyone like to share how this spoke to you? Oh, Jorgito, I see you unmuted.
I didn't know the whole thing about it. Jonah thinking, oh, God basically did this to me, I guess, because he wanted me to learn that I have sinned and like sort of own up to it, I guess, is the way to say it.
I guess that's a alright way to say it. Because God isn't responsible for the consequences of Jonah's sin. But Jonah acknowledges that God is there every single step of the way. God isn't he's not afraid of what's going to happen next. That God is still in control. And that sometimes it takes us to hit rock bottom to realize what's going on. To realize the truth about ourselves and the truth about who God is and who we are in God. So, yeah, like Jonah just sees God's fingerprints all along. That that God is still using these circumstances to bring about a mercy. It's a severe mercy because being eaten by a fish is not fun. Drowning is not fun. But God is still using this in a redemptive way to bring Jonah out to the other side. Anyone else? Well, if there's nothing else to be said, yeah, I hope y'all tune in for next week. Gonna be talking about, more Jonah. And, yeah, if you want to talk about this afterwards or whatever, you have thoughts, questions, comments that come up afterwards, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to talk about this on the side. And, yeah, just keep this in the forefront. This prayer is very special to me. It speaks to me. It's very profound, and I hope that it can be useful for you as well, too. If you ever come across a circumstance where you find yourself almost like reading this side in this prayer itself verbatim. So yeah, we have Danny's message next. I hope to see y'all there. Tune in on Twitch. Or yeah, he streams on Twitch, right? Yeah, just tune in on Twitch. I hope y'all. So. Yeah, Twitch. Awesome. Thank you for people in the Zoom for joining. Y'all sure you don't want to share anything else? Y'all a bit quiet. Sure? No. Oh, go ahead.
It's just kind of also a good reminder of like how we should how do I say this? How we should treat people that we like seeing this this picture of God's grace. It's like a good reminder to see how we should treat other people that, I mean, as humans we can be very judgmental and just sometimes we're like, oh, people are too far gone for me to like, or we just hate on certain people. But it's a good reminder to like see that even we're saying their sin and judging them based on that, but God, like, God reached out for Jonah even when he ran away from him, and it's like we should bestow like a similar mercy, I guess.
Yeah, they should show the same grace. And I think it brings up a good point that, like, who are we to say that the circumstances someone's are in is because of the consequences of their own sin or someone else's sin,
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, all we can do is to be that presence of Christ in their life. To show that grace and mercy and support, and love. As they're struggling through whatever it is they're struggling through. Yeah. Janitza, you know what I mean? Y'all want to share or comment on something? I don't know. Question? I don't know.
No, I have nothing.
Me either.
All right. Well, then, let's just end it off there. Thank you again, everybody in the Zoom. And hope to see you all next week.
Thank you, David.
No, I hope... Thank you all for showing up and participating. I hope this spoke to you some way, somehow. Y'all learned something and are eager to learn more Jonah next week. And, yeah. Y'all have a good week. Y'all stay safe, mask up. God bless, and take care.